Hi, I'm Zahar, and welcome to the second episode of my podcast, The Weekly Point with Z. For those who are returning to the channel, I'd like to thank you for your trust. That gives me an indication that you like my content, and I do appreciate the encouragement. For those who provided feedback, I would like to thank you for your feedback. I promise that I will act upon it. I take it to heart, and I do appreciate your commitment to listening to the first episode, especially that it was on the longer side, and the feedback that you provided me to improve this process. Now, if you haven't listened to my future episode, if that's your first time coming into the podcast, then please do so, because I discussed a lot of very important topics that I would hope to expand on in future episodes, including this one. Now, as I promised in my previous episode, I would like any future episodes, including this one, to be much more focused, maybe shorter in time, and to the point, to focus on a specific topic and expand on it sufficiently rather than just scratch the surface. So for this reason, I would like to organize my episodes slightly differently by dividing them into different episodes within certain series or multiple series. And to that point, I would like to start with a few episodes or a series of episodes or a couple of series of episodes on the Middle Eastern countries, before I move or shift focus to wider global events. It's just that it provides a lot of context, and it facilitates my analysis of future events from a Middle Eastern kind of perspective, and what that would look like for someone who grew up in the Middle East and lived in different parts of the world. Now, in the previous episode, I talked about the crisis of governance in the Middle East and how this has led to the rise of centralized systems of governance, which in turn stifled any progress or any real change in the region. I would like to expand more on that in this episode, and this episode is going to be the first episode out of two in a limited series. So during this episode, I would like to discuss that particular phenomenon, what that means to the region, the new social contract that got established between these governments and internal stakeholders, so basically their people within their countries, and the contract or agreement or set of alliances that were established with Western powers, and particularly NATO, Europe, the US, and so on and so forth. And then in episode 2, I would like to talk about some of the current global events, particularly Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan, and how the Middle Eastern countries, in particular Arab countries, lost their ability to influence events on a global scale. So they're not a key player in global events. They don't influence global events, at least not events that are on the hot burner for many of us, especially those living in the West. So to start off, I would like to talk a little bit about, recap on where we left off in the previous episode, mainly around the end of World War II, and how modern Arab states or Middle Eastern states started establishing themselves, and how, because of that crisis in identity, and again, I would like to invite you to listen or watch to episode 1, listen to or watch episode 1 in case you haven't done so, because it will provide additional context. But anyway, it's that phenomenon where we got this new propped up nationalism based on a fictitious identity that the central governments in those countries took advantage of as a reaction, because there was no organic identity that was identified in a healthy way that is representative of everyone. The reaction was many of these countries established central governments that were brutally suppressive of any change, any diversity, any deviation, any representation of an alternative to the identity or version of what a citizen should look like that is established by the central government in each one of those countries. Now, this obviously stifled progress. It disallowed any reform or any change movements. It alienated a lot of the populations of these countries, especially those belonging to minority groups, but in some cases also majority groups. And so this form of governance normally led to an establishment of a new social contract between these governments and their people. This social contract is based on the fact that I, as the government, would ensure stability, would ensure a certain level of normalcy, for better or for worse, whatever that brings in, would ensure some sort of a peaceful transition of power, although within the same establishment and the same regime, but at least you don't have these vacuums of power, fluctuations, or all of the instability that brings. It's one direction and one direction only. Obviously, it's a wrong direction, but it's one direction nonetheless. And then what I would do as a government, I would protect minorities, which is very ironic because in proposing this as a key benefit from central rule, many of these governments actually suppressed minorities, and it was such a brutal process that it led to a lot of unfortunate events upon which the region is highly unstable today. And what this did is, and to provide an example of that, and I'm sorry, I'm reeling back, to provide an example of that is the alliance of minorities in Syria, whereby the government of Bashar al-Assad, and before him Hafez al-Assad, his father, who belonged to a minority sect in Syria, the Alawite sect, ruled the country and established these alliances with other minorities, like the Christian minority, like the Druze minority. And what they did is promise to protect these minorities from the Sunni majority. And this led to the minority alliance in Syria, which was instrumental in propping up the Bashar al-Assad rule, and before him Hafez al-Assad rule, so the Assad family rule, which led to the events of today and the brutal suppression of the revolt in Syria or uprising in Syria. And this is a classical example of how things are in most Middle Eastern countries, especially Arab countries. Now, this in turn presented an excellent opportunity for Western powers, particularly the US and Europe, because they saw a fail-safe system to control the region with limited resources and limited investment and make sure that this region does not fall out of line. And I will expand on this a little further, but before I do so, I would like to mention that the Middle East is more of a headache than it's pictured out to be because its proximity to Europe. And again, we discussed this in episode 1, so if you have a chance to check it out, please check it out. Its proximity to Europe and involvement in European history, it's not an alien region where things happen in isolation from Europe. It has always been part of wider nations that were controlled by Europe. It has always played a pivotal role in European history, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant region in Northern Africa, or the northern coast of Africa. This region is so important to Europe, and I don't think this is mediatized enough. that it's always on the radar of European nations and Western nations, even though they'd hate to admit it. Because by admitting it, you're admitting by extension that this region is involved in European history. Now, the rhetoric you see every day is that this is an isolated region that has nothing to do with Europe. It's culturally different. It's Eastern. It's a pivot to the East. It has nothing to do with Europe whatsoever, which is not the case, or at least not historically the case. Now, this region, whatever happens in it, has repercussions on Europe, whether it directly involves itself or not. We saw this in the recent crises in Syria with the refugees moving into Europe, because obviously there's a geographic extension and there's a certain proximity that facilitates this movement. We saw it in other parts where the war in Europe kind of had an impact, whether directly or indirectly. Sorry, the war in the Middle East had an impact directly or indirectly on some countries in Europe. But this is at the root of European interest in the region. And this is why early on, as Arab countries were being established, as they gained their independence from colonizing powers, mainly the UK and France, Europe invested heavily in propping up these systems. And in particular, if I want to discuss three different cases, I would probably discuss Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, because for those uninitiated in Middle Eastern politics, these three countries constituted the trifecta of state building in the Middle East for a long period of time, and whatever policies they had an impact on the wider Middle East, the rest of the Middle East. And if I want to discuss that in further detail and try to help you understand the involvement of Europe in propping up these regimes, if we start up with Egypt, we had the Free Officers Movement, which led a revolt or a coup d'etat against the Egyptian monarchy. It toppled the classical regime represented by the king and installed the Egyptian regime in its modern format, where army officers are in power. And it led to the rise of General Nasser in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Jamal Abdel Nasser, not Kamal, Jamal Abdel Nasser. And this led to kind of the Egyptian regime establishing itself as the de facto ruler, the Egyptian army to install itself as a de facto ruler in Egypt, and eventually led to a series of alliances with that particular regime where things are controlled and contained in a certain way. In Syria, it was the Hafiz al-Assad regime, which, it was first a revolt against the Syrian government at the time. I think it was led by General Kuwatli. And then there was a rise of the Ba'athist regime in Syria, led by Hafiz al-Assad, who again is a member of a minority group in the country, which was also propped up by the West, and they facilitated his rise because he managed to control the events in Syria. And then in Iraq, we obviously have the revolt against the monarchy there, started by General Qasim. And then it led to the rise of Saddam Hussein and President Saddam Hussein, and so on and so forth. Now, these regimes had a contentious relationship with the West, but it wasn't always the case. So up until the invasion of Kuwait, President Hussein had excellent relationships with the West, mainly because he was containing Iranian influence in the Gulf. Prior to the war in Syria, and the war with Israel. Syria's Assad had also enjoyed excellent relationships and alliances with the West. There was a lot of agreements in place, mainly their fateful invasion of Lebanon, whereby it was supposed to curb down the influence of Palestinian movements against Israel and control the scene there. There was also the alliances between the West and General Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, which were very contentious and on and off, because he kept pivoting between West and East to sort of get the best of both worlds. Whenever he didn't get something from the West, he pivoted east to the Soviet Union. And an excellent example of that is the way they built the Nasser Dam in Aswan. When the West refused to finance it, he moved to the Soviet Union, which facilitated the financing for that project. And then, after the passing of General Nasser, the relationship with the Egyptian regime, represented by President Sadat and then the President Mubarak, and so on and so forth. Now, this ensured that this region was contained, this region was controlled, this region was less of a headache for Europe and the Western world in general by extension. But it also created a situation where you have these leaders, if we could call them that, or these regimes that relied mainly or were dependent on the West, that lacked full legitimacy or credibility, and that had a huge disconnect with their people, and that prioritized issues and causes that were not necessarily aligned to the priorities of their people, the values, the objectives, their values or objectives, and created this situation where you have a shell of a government that represented what a de facto stable state would look like, but was more of a shell that did not represent the will of any of the people in these countries. And this kind of deprived these regimes of the ability to kind of command respect from their counterparts, mainly in the West, and deprived them of any real influence beyond the borders of their countries. Now, I would like to expand on that in the next episode. I just want to allow for these ideas to be shared, to provide the context and allow you to imagine what the Middle East looked like at that period, and how this led to the Middle East that we know today. And then in the next episode, I would like to talk more about this phenomenon and provide additional detailing on why this is the case. Now, if you enjoyed this content, please react. Please like it, if you could like it, or comment, send me an email, contact me in any way. I would love to interact with you and share thoughts. And I would like to remind you that this content is also available in audio format. So if you're not watching on YouTube, it's available in audio only format. And you could find this podcast or this channel on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Now, hopefully it will be available on other platforms in the future, but for now, these are the three main platforms if you would like to listen to this content in audio-only format. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode.